As a towering figure in science history, Blaise Pascal made substantial contributions to the fields of mathematics and physics, and his book Pensées is a classic work of Christian apologetics and reflection, despite not being completed because of Pascal's premature death at age 39. What isn't as well known is that one of the main motivations for writing the Pensées was the miraculous healing of his niece, Marguerite Perrier. Her healing was one of the first of 80 reported healings that took place at the Jansenist monastery of Port Royal. These healings were widely publicized and investigated, and while some were later shown to be clearly fraudulent, others were reportedly supported by medical evidence and authenticated by church authorities. It was the Jansenist miracles that the philosopher David Hume refers to when he writes, "Many of the miracles were immediately proved upon the spot before judges of unquestioned integrity, attested by witnesses of credit and distinction in a learned age, and in the most eminent theater that is now in the world. Nor is this all. A relation of them was published and dispersed everywhere, nor were the Jesuits, though a learned body, supported by the civil magistrate, and determined enemies to those opinions, in whose favor the miracles were said to have been wrought, ever able distinctly to refute or detect them. Where shall we find a number of circumstances agreeing to the corroboration of one fact?" Hume then proceeded to quickly dismiss the reports, writing, "What have we to oppose to such a cloud of witnesses but the absolute impossibility or miraculous nature of the events which they relate? And this surely, in the eyes of all reasonable people, will alone be regarded as a sufficient refutation." So without argument, Hume rather safely assumes that no one would defend this account. Why is that? Well, this was at least partially because Marguerite Perrier was part of the early Jansenist movement. The Jansenists were regarded as a heretical sect by the majority of French Catholics, and for Hume's largely Anglican and Presbyterian audience, they were still way too Catholic. This little sect was pretty much hated by everybody. By pitting Protestants against Catholics, Hume's dismissal was a standard move by skeptics of his time, as the Protestants would often dismiss Catholic miracle claims out of hand. Admittedly, I too find many of the Jansenist miracle claims from this time to be pretty iffy because of the investigation of critics much nearer to the time. But the healing of Perrier is a little bit more difficult to disregard. Here's the story. At the age of 6, Marguerite Perrier developed a condition known as a lacrimal fistula in the corner of her left eye next to her nose. This means that she had a channel from which tears and other bodily fluids would continually leak. Pascal was present at the onset of her condition and describes it as beginning with some drops of water which fell out of the corner of the said left eye next to the nose. The discharge rapidly grew more frequent and vicious and eventually changing into something like mud. In the following years, doctors who examined Perrier recommended cauterization, but they couldn't guarantee that her eye would survive the process. Rather than take such a serious risk, the family tried less harsh remedies. The condition got worse, so the family decided in August of 1655 to stop treatment in hopes that her body would heal itself. But unfortunately that didn't happen. Eventually a tumor formed in her nose, and the fluid from the fistula flooded into her nose and mouth to the point where she experienced difficulty breathing, eating, and sleeping. At the time, she was living at a school associated with the Port Royal monastery. Sadly, the smell from this fluid became so disgusting that she had to be separated from the other students. By early March of 1656, she was so emaciated that the family was willing to risk cauterization to save her life. The family began to make preparations for the operation. Then on March 24th, the Port Royal monastery received a relic purported to be a thorn from the crown of Jesus Christ. Was this thorn originally from Jesus' crown? Well, I don't think anyone today would argue that it was. Regardless, the relic provided a contact point for Perrier's faith. That evening, after Vespers, the girls from school walked past the relic. When it was Perrier's turn, she was told by the teacher, "Commend yourself to God and touch the thorn to your eye." She did so and returned to her room afterward. She had barely reached her room when she said to one of the other girls, "My sister, I am no longer in pain. The holy thorn has cured me." Here's a report of what happened afterwards, and I quote, "The source of the mud, which was flowing continuously from her eye, her nose, and her mouth, and which had been flowing on her cheek to a moment before the miracle, was completely dried up. The bone, which had been decayed and rotten, was restored to its original condition. All the stench which had been associated with her wound, and which was so intolerable that the girl had to be separated from others by order of the doctors and surgeons, was changed into a breath as sweet as an infant's. At the same time, she recovered her sense of smell, and none of the ills which were the result of the main one returned. Even her color, which had been pale and leaden, became as lively and clear as it had ever been." Unquote. Marguerite Perrier's healing became so well known that both the Queen Mother and the King of France sent their own physicians to check her out. A number of prominent physicians and religious authorities investigated the healing in detail. Together with the doctors who treated her since the onset of her illness, they unanimously concluded that there were no medical causes for her recovery. It should be, however, noted that Guy Patin, a former dean of the Paris Faculty of Medicine, disputed their testimony. He said that some were too closely associated with Port-Royal to avoid bias, and others were unqualified, quote, barber surgeons. It's unclear exactly what motivated these statements. Even the Jesuits, who were determined opponents of the Jansenists, recognized that the miracle occurred, however. They just emphasized that it shouldn't be interpreted to establish the Jansenist hyper-Augustinian theological doctrines. In fact, one prominent Jesuit leader said that it was a sign for the Jansenists to repent of their heresy. So even their religious opponents agreed that something supernatural happened. This miracle was a public event that was an object of sense that one's eyes could readily judge. There was even a painting of Perrier made from near the time of the event to commemorate the miracle. So what should we make of this miracle report? Both Christian philosopher Robert Larmer and biblical scholar Craig Keener believe that this report was legitimate enough to document it in their published works. Neither are Roman Catholic. Now, if you remember from an earlier video that I made, I went into detail about the doubts filter, which is a religiously neutral historical test to help us know when a miracle could be rationally doubted without a whole lot of investigation. You might want to pause the video at this point and give it a watch to get up to speed. With that in mind, however, let's run this claim through the filter. First, let's take a look at distance and belated reports. This report was made in Paris at the time of the event, not from far away and many years later. So this claim meets the first two criteria quite nicely. Now, was the event uncertain? In other words, could the miracle be explained as a natural event without implausibility? Some skeptics of the miracle have commented that she may have been misdiagnosed with a tear duct obstruction, but that doesn't explain the disappearance of the disease nor the tumor after coming in contact with the thorn. This event was very unlikely to suddenly just happen, and it is capable of being identified as a special occurrence beside the fact that it happened, which indicates that it was done on purpose by an intelligent agent. So no, I don't think that it was an uncertain event. Pardon me for bouncing around the filter here, but let's ask ourselves if the miracle claim was self-serving. As I already noted, both the Jesuits and the Jansenists offered conflicting theological interpretations that could be seen as self-serving, but that was after the fact, and the two different interpretations seem to cancel each other out. It seems there was no apparent self-serving reason for a young girl to report such a miracle. I saved the final two criteria out of order for last because I think this is where one might raise some concerns. While the Jansenists and Jesuits fought over what the miracle meant, both sides probably believed that the relic Perrier came into contact with had some serious religious significance. Both were of the established superstitious opinion that the thorn was part of Jesus' crown, and that coming into contact with the relic could theoretically bring about some kind of miracle. That said, it is hard to hand-wave away that Pascal's niece needed surgery and then didn't after coming into contact with the thorn. And that brings me to the final criteria. Was this miracle trivial? I mean, clearly the thorn wasn't really the thorn from Jesus' crown, and it's not initially clear what theological teaching this miracle would confirm. Jansenism isn't really a thing these days, and their doctrine has since been condemned by the Catholic Church. It's really not a debatable topic anymore. In the case of the resurrection, Jesus claimed to be Israel's divine Messiah, and that him being raised to immortality would prove that he was establishing a new covenant here on the earth. This miracle, on the other hand, has a much lower level of sign significance, and so one might be tempted to just shrug it off. So let's think about healing miracles for just a moment. A lifelong atheist who has gone blind from macular degeneration, but is healed through allowing themselves to be prayed for, might come to believe in God. But that might not cause them to become convinced of Christianity right on the spot, but rather of God's existence and his general love for them. Such an experience would probably at least cause them to want to learn more about the claims of different religions, and if a Christian prayed for them, they might want to start with Christianity. But as a single event, a healing of this sort has limited revelatory significance. Remember that Jesus often reportedly healed people out of compassion and not necessarily as a special sign. So Christian apologists need to be careful not to claim more for the doctrinal implications of various miracles than such events actually warrant. This was the mistake of both the Jansenists and the Jesuits. They both made too much about the theological significance of the miracle. Here's what I think. While I can't be certain, maybe God had mercy on a little girl who was terribly suffering. Perhaps God didn't want this young lady to be isolated and in pain anymore. As silly as it may seem to us, her touching the thorn that she mistook to be associated with Jesus might have been the small kernel of faith necessary enough to access the healing power of God. Who says that God always has to play by our theological rules? And maybe God knew that this would ignite faith not only for this little girl, but for her uncle as well. And perhaps God knew that Pascal would go on to write a very influential book that would teach and inspire Christians for centuries, and so he acted specially. Obviously, I'm not in a place where I can say for sure, but it is at least plausible to me. Unlike her uncle, Marguerite Perrier lived a long life, dying at age 87. She lived a mostly secluded life as a nun and devoted herself to charitable works, and later in life she helped found a mission and a hospital. Importantly, she preserved her uncle's arithmetic machines and his writings and bequeathed them to a French oratory. So was Pascal's niece really miraculously healed? I don't know if I would wager on it, bad pun intended, but I think it's slightly more probable than not.